Thank you, sir. Thank you once again to the organizers for this opportunity. And I would not be addressing the main theme of this seminar, which is social media. I'm dealing with an older canvas of the conventional media. Now, in the course of the discussions this morning, I found that there's this concern about how social media is impacting on our lives and how it's changing the public discourse. And it just occurred to me that a usage that I had come across some years back, which now I don't encounter very much, but I think it's fairly appropriate to recall this, that social media was referred to then as the fifth estate. We've kind of got used to this old cliche of the press and the media being the fourth estate. Now here's a notion of the fifth estate coming up. And, okay, there's this projection going on, but I will not be sticking to the script, if you'll forgive me. When I come to the script, I'll tell you, you can cue it to that point. And incidentally, I've circulated, I've sent this to Alankar, and I will send it again at the weekend with a few corrections, a few typos to be corrected, maybe a few additions in the light of today's discussions. So, what does that term fifth estate mean? I mean, and what does it mean for us that we are stepping into this domain of the fifth estate when we are yet to agree on the rules of engagement for the fourth estate? We've got kind of addicted to that cliche. Every discussion on the media begins and ends with the invocation of the principle of the fourth estate. What does that mean? Do we really understand? Now, invariably, it's accompanied by two kinds of the debate on press freedom is accompanied by two kinds of jibes. One is that press freedom exists only for those who own one, and the second is that it's not freedom of the press, it's freedom of the purse that we're talking about. So, there are still lots of issues to negotiate in our understanding of the media and society, and I'm trying to kind of address some of those in this particular address. So it's usual. It's a kind of assumption that the fourth estate, as it's called, embodies a larger social right, entitlement, which is the right of free speech, and that's the principle on which the fourth estate claims certain rights and privileges. Now, free speech, of course, is a right inherent in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948, and is the instrument which is by far the most widely subscribed to covenant in international diplomacy and politics. Article 19 of the UDHR conceives of free speech as a radical investiture of rights in the individual, and the precise wording is very interesting. It says everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression, including the freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Now, obviously, this is a very, very broad investiture of rights, and in the real world, in the practical domain, this has to be diluted. Now, the grounds on which such a dilution can take place have been, to some extent, laid down in the following international instrument, which was drafted in 1954, adopted and opened up for signature in 1966, and effective as part of the International Bill of Rights since 1974. This is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So there you have a qualification introduced, which is that the exercise of the rights provided for carries with it certain special duties and responsibilities. It may, therefore, be subject to certain restrictions, but these shall only be such as are provided by law and are necessary for respect of the rights and reputations of others, for the protection of national security or of public order or of public health or morals. Now, this is, of course, a kind of stirring at this, at the root of this distinction made is a kind of contrast between two notions of liberty. There's a positive notion of liberty, which is the liberty to do as you please, and a negative notion of liberty, which is the liberty to defend a zone of autonomy, of personal autonomy, that is essential to your dignity as a human being. Now, the exercise of positive liberty can often intrude into, be invasive of the rights of others. So there have to be certain restraints. Now, the rights and reputation of others, the rights to personal reputation and privacy, cannot be invaded by the exercise of another person's positive liberty. That is one of the principles inherent here. And the right, and when national security comes in, it's a little bit more problematic, because national security could be understood as the defense of the rights of the citizens, which could be invaded by one individual's exercise of positive liberty. But on the other hand, it could be understood also in terms of the interests of the people in power, the people who are in authority, a narrow ruling class defending its right by using the slogan of national security. So how do you prevent a worthwhile exception that's granted on grounds of national security from becoming an active violation of the right of free speech? Now, Indian jurisprudence has addressed this in various judgments over the years, and that is slightly, it's a little off topic, I will not go in there. But I'll just say that if you look at the recent strictures and arrests and the prosecution suffered by social media users for posting material on Twitter or Facebook and so on, it's very clear that the ground is still unsettled. We are still not sure when a restriction on a free speech right is justified and when it is not. When does it become a colorable and arbitrary exercise of power by those in authority, whether it's the local police or the government or whatever else. Anybody in power or anybody with wealth and influence in society can move the courts for clamping down on the rights of free speech of those who are less influential or wealthy. And the Section 66A of the Information Technology Act enshrines this kind of process, because it goes well beyond the constitutional definitions of reasonable restrictions, in including things like causing annoyance and so on and so forth, which are can be very broadly interpreted and can be, for that very reason, widely abused. So I will now just look at some of the key milestones in the story of free speech in India, which I'll just recount some of these, and then we'll move on to the discussion of the broader implications. Now, the First Amendment, which was introduced soon after the Constitution was adopted, allowed for certain restrictions on free speech right by broadening the range of situations in which governments could restrain free speech. Now, it's an irony that's often noted that the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution had the opposite intent as the US First Amendment. But there is no denying that the First Amendment to the US Constitution also has a great deal of ambiguity inherent in it. The specific language of the amendment, which forbids any legislation curtailing freedom of press and the right to free speech, has led to conflicting interpretations. Key here is the right of public access to the media space. Scholars have argued endlessly over the specific mention of the press as a protected entity. Yeah, I think you can move on. So the scholars argue the prevalent judicial orthodoxy, which accords with the doctrine of strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution, is that the authors of that foundational document must have had a specific intent in extending the a measure of protection of the press. Why is the press mentioned separately in the First Amendment of the US Constitution? When you say free speech, you assume that it also covers the press, but then the First Amendment makes a specific mention of it. So what is the implication of that? So the US Supreme Court has interpreted that to say that allowing the right of public access to the press would be violative of the protected character of the press. So there's no right of public access. It's a subtle point, but the press has a charter of rights which is distinct from the public and protected by Constitution. Now, it was an anomalous state. It was an anomalous state, perhaps arising from a poor job of draftsmanship, and it created a situation where the press was immune to any demand from the public that a particular viewpoint should be accommodated. When you say that you're not presenting my viewpoint accurately or fairly, you can't go to the press and say that you have an obligation to do this. Now, under the fairness doctrine, which was imposed in 1949, to ensure that different opinions gain a voice and that all issues of consequence should be reported from diverse perceptions. The fairness doctrine originated in the belief that broadcasters were gaining a right to use a scarce public resource, that is, the electromagnetic spectrum, for a commercial purpose, and were hence obliged to respect the whole range of public opinions. And they couldn't just saturate it with one particular opinion, they were obliged to present the whole range of opinions. Now, the argument for repealing the fairness doctrine gained ground through the 1970s and 1980s, partly using the argument that broadcast media should not be burdened by rules of public access that the print media was unconstrained by. Now, when you say print media is cannot be obliged to accommodate all public voices, but broadcasters, there's an asymmetry there. So that argument gained ground. There were voices which argued that the unpopular cause guaranteed to gain little traction, that the way forward was to bring print under the same obligations to represent the public voice as broadcast. In 1987, the US Federal Communications Council voted unanimously to repeal the fairness doctrine, which was always a normative state that broadcast license holders were encouraged to conform to. It never had the force of law. It was a normative state. It was kind of there were instances where broadcast licenses were revoked on grounds that fairness was violated, but those were very few. It really didn't have that force of law. So the argument then advanced was that, right at the end, we seek to extend to the electronic press the same First Amendment guarantees that the print media have enjoyed since our country's inception. So there were two options. You could either impose the same rules of public access on the press or undo those rules for the broadcast media. And for obvious reasons, they chose the latter option because of the power of the media and the power of the industry, the lobby. It was a fairly robustly established inference by then that competition, supposedly the ironclad guarantee of diversity in the public space, was not really about ideas or opinions, but about securing the most ample access to advertising money. The media as an industry that trades in information as a commodity. It caters to a defined audience and seeks profit through reaching out to the particular needs and interests of that audience. There are two broad categories of information that are transacted: news and advertisement. The two are different in that the attributes, or at least the claim of factuality and veracity, are embedded in one, while for the other, truth value is regarded as dispensable. For news, there's a claim of factuality advanced. For advertisement, no such claim is necessary. It's dispensable. If at all, truth is meant to be served only on a collateral basis in an advertisement, since the primary objective is to induce the recipient audience to make a particular kind of commercial decision. There are infinite number of truths and untruths uttered on any average day, though most of these remain unheard. What matters is volubility. It's the volume of speech that matters. It is not the content of speech. The modern media is organized in a fashion that allows supposed truths that enjoy the substantial buoyancy imparted by the partial truths of advertising to achieve the greatest diffusion. It is not just speech that is protected, but also the volume of the speech. Even if a partial truth uttered loudly and with seeming conviction should drown out other acts of speech with at least equal claims to truth. There are two milestones in Indian media law which have made this the applicable principle in practical matters involving press freedom. These are the 1962 judgment of the Supreme Court in the case of Sakal newspaper, second paragraph, and the 72 judgment in the case of Bennett Coleman and Company Limited. So interestingly, in India, past that part, but during Constituent Assembly debates, this point was raised whether you need to have a special provision on press freedom. And Dr. Ambedkar, I think the consensus opinion in the House, which was underlined and reaffirmed by B.R. Ambedkar, was that free speech is the right under which the press gains its entitlements. So there's no need for a specific mention of the press. In fact, once you say free speech, the press gains its rights under that clause. So unlike in the US, there is no special protection for media under Indian law. Now, let me come to these judgments now. Advertising imparts additional buoyancy to speech. News media is unique in invariably selling its product at a price well below cost of production. For this reason, early attention in evolving a policy for the media in India focused on the need to restrain the possibility of predatory pricing by the larger enterprises. This involved the rationing of official advertising and an interventionist stance to ensure that media enjoying the benefit of large private advertising did not leverage that into an advantage in selling price to drive small players out. So there was an effort to protect diversity in the news media by ensuring that there was no unfair, predatory pricing and unfair competition. In the Sakal case, the Supreme Court held unconstitutional as a regulatory measure, requiring all newspapers to maintain a selling price that was proportionate to the number of printed pages. The judicial determination was that this regulation could potentially damage newspaper profitability by restricting circulation growth. There was no warrant to circumscribe the right to commerce enjoyed by one group of citizens, that is to say the larger media companies. The right to commerce is also a fundamental right. So the argument was that you can't restrain the right to commerce of one category of citizens, which are the larger media companies, in order to better protect the right of free speech of another group of companies, which are the smaller media companies. In the Bennett Coleman case, which came 10 years later, the Supreme Court employed an analogous judicial philosophy to strike down the rationing of newsprint in a situation of acute scarcity of the commodity. It argued, among other things, that there was no constitutional warrant for limiting the rights of one class of citizens, that is to say large newspapers, in order to better protect the rights of another, which are the smaller newspapers. Because in a situation of scarcity, the rationing policy sought to ensure that smaller newspapers got quota newsprint and were not subject to unfair restraints on circulation. The judgment in the Bennett Coleman case is of historic significance, since it lays out a whole range of norms on the exercise of the right of free speech, and also because of the notable dissent by Justice K.K. Matthew. The majority opinion in the court seemed to oscillate wildly and indecisively between a notion of free speech as a privilege that is enjoyed by the few and a broader conception in which the unreserved exercise of the right would engender situations of conflict. Speaking for the majority on the bench, Justice A.M. Ray observed that the individual rights of freedom of speech and expression of editors, directors, and shareholders are all expressed through their newspapers. Okay, well, it's gone a bit ahead of the script, but I'll catch up. So here he's saying the freedom of speech of Editors, directors, and shareholders are expressed through their newspapers. Then a few pages on, in the same judgment, the same judge says, it is indisputable that by freedom of the press is meant the right of all citizens to speak, publish, and express their views. The freedom of the press embodies the right of the people to read. The freedom of the press is not antithetical to the right of the people to speak and express. So, in the space of a few pages, he's broadening that ambit from editors, shareholders, and directors to all citizens. On what basis he does that, there's no real explanation. Now that is addressed in the minority opinion, the dissenting judgment by Justice Matthew. The perspective here is reversed. Rather than rule it out, Justice Matthew explicitly concedes the possibility of a conflict between the public interest and the profit motivations of the press as a commercial institution. Using a theory of the freedom of the press that essentially views it in terms of twin entitlements, to speak and be informed, Justice Matthew observed that the distribution of newsprint for maintenance of newspaper circulation at its highest possible level would only advance and enrich that freedom. As a constitutional principle, freedom of the press was no higher than the freedom of speech of a citizen. What was essential in the circumstances was to evolve an affirmative theory underlying freedom of expression and to attend to the various conditions essential to maintaining a workable system. The problem at hand was one of bringing all ideas into the market. So again, he's talking about diversity of views. They've all equal right to come to the market. It's not just the loud voices and the people who have the largest advertising support, with that buoyancy, that have the right to come to the market, from all points of view. And to make the freedom of speech a live one, having its roots in reality. In pursuit of this ideal, it was necessary as a first step to recognize that the right of expression, these are his exact words, is somewhat thin if it can be exercised only on the sufferance of the managers of the leading newspapers. So here implicitly there's a mention of a conflict between the press, the exercise of the free speech right of the press, and the public right to express all points of view and to hear all points of view. Diversity is not just about expressing. I can sit in a room and express every kind of viewpoint I want, but when there's nobody to listen, that's not really exercise of free speech. Free speech involves access to the media, as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights itself says in Article 19, through all media and irrespective of national frontiers. That is the ideal state of the freedom of speech. So, in later judgments, in other contexts, the Indian Supreme Court has held that, how much time do I have, sir? 12:30? Yeah. Okay. Has held that the state-owned broadcaster cannot abuse its monopoly of the airwaves. Now, this is a very important judgment. It came in the case of a film made on the Bhopal gas tragedy, which won a national award as best documentary of the year, and Doordarshan refused to telecast it. Now, Supreme Court held that this is a public monopoly of the airwaves, and you cannot restrain the telecast of this important documentary, which is a public interest. It's an abuse of power if you deny the public the information that's built into that documentary. And similarly, in another case involving Life Insurance Corporation, the court has held that a state-owned corporation engaged in the service industry has to ensure that the public has access to media owned by it, even to articulate a viewpoint critical of its services. Let's say if LIC has a house journal, you are obliged, because it is a public sector and a government entity, it cannot deny the right of access to the public to express viewpoints that could be even critical of the corporation. You cannot, that would be an abuse of power again. These rulings upholding the right of public access to media space and time are applicable to state-controlled entities and do not stipulate a similar right where the media is privately owned. What is the story with private enterprises? That's really where we have to. That's really where the core of the problem lies. So these are judgments that rather hesitantly opened up just a glimmer of hope for diversity and the right of public access to media space and time. In 1996, the Supreme Court, in its ruling in what's called the Airwaves case, which is Cricket Association of Bengal versus Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, reinstated the principles in substantive measure, principles of diversity and public access. Called upon to decide a seemingly trivial matter of telecast rights for a cricket match, the Supreme Court pronounced a judgment of far-reaching significance. As Justice P.B. Sawant put it, in one of two concurring judgments, the airwaves of frequencies are a public property. Their use has to be controlled and regulated by a public authority in the interests of the public and to prevent the invasion of their rights. So there's a virtually explicit statement there that a public monopoly or even a private oligarchy over the oligopoly over the airwaves represents an invasion of the rights of citizens. So let me just skip this. I think the point is well understood. The airwaves judgment, in short, urged the adoption of a new paradigm that transcended the dichotomy between government control and free enterprise. On one side, it asserted the paramount need to rescue the electronic media from government monopoly and bureaucratic control and have an independent authority to manage and control it. When the electronic media, as Justice Sawant again put it, is controlled by one central agency or a few private agencies of the rich, there is a need for another body representing all sections of society. Again, very clear statement that media freedom is maybe it's an absolute state which we can't attain, but when you have media diversity and guaranteed conditions of media diversity, you're kind of approaching that ideal state. And media diversity inherently means allowing all voices to be heard, allowing all voices access, and allowing all voices to be heard. And it involves the right of every person to speak, and also the right of every person to hear all points of view. Then official policy, of course, continued in its course of muddling through the seductions of advertising. Even if governments would like to pretend otherwise, there is little question that policy decisions in the broadcast sector fit into two categories. They are either defensive responses to predatory moves by media corporations, particularly those of foreign origin. Now, some of the most important changes in media policy in recent years have been made as defensive response. Now, there's an invasion from the sky by Star TV and so on. You can't do anything about it. You can't go policing every dish antenna there is. So then you start defensive response by first seeking to reinforce the public monopoly, the public sector monopoly. And when you find that that is impossible, then you allow private broadcasters access through public channels in a very limited fashion. Then you find that also is not working. Finally, you say, okay, let's just open up the doors. But there's a 10-year delay in that process, in the course of which you've lost much valuable preparation time, and you could have kind of built up a viable industry and competitive industry in that time, which has been lost. That opportunity was lost. So let me just come to the phenomenon of advertising now. Advertising has been among the most loosely monitored and governed areas of global business. Yet it is of sufficient consequence in an average life to have gained the title of the hidden persuader. This is a phrase coined by Vance Packard, who was a US management sociologist from the 1950s. In US jurisprudence, advertising has acquired the status of free speech, protected under the First Amendment to the Constitution. And that has been reinforced in recent times. It's a complicated story, but at the moment, it has the full protection of the First Amendment, advertising. And the reason that they've given a recent judgment in a case called Citizens United is that if you start restraining advertising, it's in the context of political advertising for elections. If you start restraining advertising, then the next step could be a restraint on news and editorial. Now, they mix up the two, whereas it's a traditional media to regard the two as separate and subject to distinct rules. Now, the legal position in India is that advertising is not covered by the free speech guarantees of the Constitution. This was determined by the Supreme Court as far back as 1959 in the matter of Hamdard Tawakhana and another versus the Union of India, which involved the constitutional challenge to the law enabling regulatory authorities to prohibit certain varieties of advertising. The Supreme Court then held that when speech takes the form of a commercial advertisement, which has an element of trade or commerce, it no longer falls within the concept of freedom of speech. This was for the simple reason that the object is not propagation of ideas, social, political, or economic, or furtherance of literature or human thought. In fact, as in the case under consideration, the matter could be about the commendation of the efficacy, value, and importance of treatment of particular diseases of certain drugs and medicines. Now, it's worthwhile because we have a very clear judicial position that advertisements are not protected by free speech guarantees. Let's assess this finding of the Supreme Court. The next one, against a declaration by the Vice Chairman of Bennett and Company Limited, which is India's largest business, largest media group with interest in print, television, radio, and internet, that he sees himself as a player in the advertising industry. This is an exact quote from an article in the New Yorker, published in 2010. Vineet Jain, Vice Chairman, tells Ken Auletta, who traveled through India extensively and spoke to him at length, we are not in the newspaper business, we are in the advertising business. So does he then merit protection under the free speech guarantees? I mean, so you need to really debate that. Now, to return to the origins of the term fourth estate, it's a usage that has become almost reflexive in the argument for press freedom as a principle embodying the wider good is being strongly affirmed. The term is commonly attributed to Edmund Burke and his ostensible reference to the opening of British parliamentary proceedings to the press in 1787. Politics till then was the preserve of the three recognized estates of the polity: the lords spiritual and temporal, and the commons. There was a monarchy, the clergy, the nobility, and all the rest were what were called the commons. And Burke was alluding with his coinage of a new term to the potential transformation of the political discourse that the entry of the press could bring about. Despite its appeal to common sense, this is an attribution that still remains wrapped in obscurity. It was just not sufficient for the press to enter into parliamentary deliberations in a passive reportorial capacity. It's one thing for the press to come in and report, like a stenographer, that so-and-so such and such was said in Parliament. That reporting also had to be an element in a wider political discourse. That's when it becomes an active element, when it connects to a wider political discourse. The fourth estate, in the sense, was a fairly useless appellation, unless it was part of the active political project of one among the other three estates, or of the excluded sections that none of the three estates recognized. So the fourth estate became an active element in politics only because it was connected to elements within the third estate, and within the third estate, that particular strata that was rising in the early period of the Industrial Revolution, the commercial industrial bourgeoisie, as it's called. So I think I'll have to skip a little bit, but the point here is very simple, and I think in 1848, Karl Marx, as usual, he comes up with certain very sharp observations, was to observe with abundant irony that the unlimited freedom of the press guaranteed in the 1793 Constitution of the French Revolution, that was the most radical constitution that came out of the French Revolution, although it promised unfettered freedom for the press, it introduces a clause saying that it should not be permitted when it compromises public freedom. Press freedom in that context was seen, in other words, as detrimental to the public good, since it could potentially add to the ongoing disorder. This basic confusion evidently continues to be an issue today. Marx's conclusion from here was that freedom is a natural state of man and no law could be written to negate that. Chafing under the repressive censorship of the German Confederation, he argued, no man combats freedom. At most, he combats freedom of others. When you say that restraints have been introduced on the press, it means that, I don't want to be restrained in my speech, but others should be, Effectively, that's what is the basis of that argument. So inherently, to say that press freedom should be restrained is to argue against human freedom. Laws are in no way repressive measures against freedom, any more than the law of gravity is a repressive measure against motion. So then who is arguing the restraint of whose speech? That really is the question here. So let's look at Britain. Let's go ahead a bit. The reign of mediocrity. In nearby Britain, the situation remained equally ambiguous. The libertarian philosopher John Stuart Mill spoke of the law in Britain being as servile as in the time of Tudors. Now, he was extremely committed advocate of free speech, of the whole range of liberties, in fact. Mill's backing for free speech did not go so far as to advocate press freedom as an unconditional legal guarantee. Perhaps the press did not merit a distinct consideration, since Mill, as with all liberal thinkers of his time, assumed that with laws that met libertarian standards of integrity, all voices, including the minority opinions that Mill insisted on getting their due, would be heard. With all that, Mill concluded in sober truth that the general tendency, now that's a very important quotation, the last 5 lines, the general tendency of things throughout the world is to render mediocrity the ascendant power among mankind. The novelty, he observed in his time, was that the mass did not take its opinion from the authorities held in awe in earlier times. The clout, the influence wielded by those in established authority had waned. The church or the state, often the ostensible leaders of society, rather their thinking is done for them by men such as, much like themselves, addressing them or speaking in their name on the spur of the moment through the newspapers. So, already in the period of greatest press freedom, when liberalism was triumphant, Mill was bemoaning that it was the reign of mediocrity. That was today when we talk about the media being dumbing down and the race to the bottom and so on. We should remember that this is the inevitable consequence of media that privileges profit, and that is based upon an advertising model. Because that was a period when the so-called penny press, which was dominant in Britain earlier, which was, I'm sorry, it's this bad problem of adjusting to altitude. Penny press, which was the voice of various factions of British radical movements, the diggers, the levelers, and so on, was phased out by repressive laws and also by co-optation, by immigration to Australia and so on. The ranks were thinned out, and that whole wave of dissent had died down. And that's when advertising became the major driver of media content. And that's when the reign of mediocrity also started. So Mill saw the mediocrity that was in evidence all around, but failed to detect the method behind it or even to engage with its production and reproduction. Beyond throwing up his arms in despair and hoping that time would bring about a change for the better, he chose not to question why the liberal society he was portraying could not quite summon up those resources of critical thought to frontally address the mediocrity that seemed its characteristic stamp. Why was it that from all the opinions and perspectives it had before it, the press chose to only portray the lowest common denominator? The answer probably lies in unpacking another of the key concepts of the modern social order, the notion of civil society. And I'll just switch to another thinker, Hegel, who was a key figure in the evolution of this idea of civil society. In 1809, Hegel wrote in his diary that the daily newspaper habit seemed a serviceable substitute for the ritual of the morning prayer. Hegel was, as he wrote these lines, still in a very preliminary stage of evolving his thinking on civil society and the state. For early thinkers of the European Enlightenment, civil society and the political state were terms that could be used interchangeably to represent mankind's liberation from the state of nature. The state of nature, in turn, was variously interpreted. Now, civil society as a theoretical construct in Hegel's doctrine was about submerging antagonisms into a higher, divinely ordained sense of concord. There were two kinds of thinking then. One was that competition in society is the force for the common good, but then there was no consensus on how that competition it does not explode in unending conflict. So Hegel's response to that was civil society is the means by which these antagonisms are composed. Civil society was about submerging antagonisms into a higher, divinely ordained sense of concord. Now, Hegel was also a believer. He believed that this is the divine purpose, that competition should be composed and that civil society emerges as the kind of harmonious expression of that divine will. To the extent that the Hegelian perception has had a bearing on contemporary understanding, civil society, it's a process, it's not a thing. Civil society is not a thing, it's a process of transforming minute particularities in a complex and evolving society into a unified perception which feeds into state policy. Now, this is an infirm concept. Hegel proved thoroughly indifferent to class stratification as he brought all the diversities of the social milieu into a mystical union that served the higher purpose of the state. Where civil society did not have a means to bring all individuals within the compact that would preserve unity and solidarity, he invested the state with that coercive power. When civil society cannot solve the problems inherent in the competition and conflict of man against man, the state will assume that power. So, in a way, it's about civil society as the domain of consensus and consent. And when that consent does not function adequately, then you have the power of the state, the coercive power of the state, the law, the force of the law comes into play. Now, civil society receded as a category with succeeding generations of thinkers. Antonio Gramsci, part of the third generation Marxist theorists, grappled with the concept and sought to make it an integral part of political strategy. But I think we can't get into that. Moving ahead for the two generations, we arrive at the Marxist philosopher Jürgen Habermas and the manner in which he rendered much needed clarity to civil society, both in terms of concept and historical fact, with his construct of the public sphere. I'm sure media students everywhere would be familiar with that concept, the public sphere. Although it's been variously interpreted. I think when you look at Habermas's original formulation of that concept, you'll see some of the reasons for this reign of mediocrity, as we call it. Now, let me just skip ahead a bit. The public sphere stood or fell with the principle of universal access. Even if there is no universal access, now we talk about the media and the right of public access, diversity and so on. Even if there is not such a situation, there has to be that appearance of universal access. So that's what Habermas here is arguing. I think you can just go ahead. You go too far here. Anyway. The public sphere stood or fell with the principle of universal access, since one that excluded specific groups on account of identity or class or whatever, language, ethnicity, class, whatever, was indeed not a public sphere at all. So you have to have that illusion of access for all. As a construct, the public sphere needed the necessary safeguard that economic and social conditions would not deny anybody admission, that specifically all who desired could earn the qualifications of private autonomy that made for the educated and property-owning person. So mass media, Habermas observes, was based on the commercialization of participation in the public sphere on the part of the broad strata, designed predominantly to give the masses in general access to the public sphere. So commercialization changes the character of the public sphere in ways that ultimately leads to that reign of mediocrity, which Mill was bemoaning a century before. So penny press was the original model of the press in Britain at the early phase of industrialization. And that was, in a manner of speaking, a much more diverse situation, because many more voices being heard. Now, whether being heard by all or not, it occurred despite the absence of a protective legal environment. Now, when the penny press kind of is on the wane, and the advertisement-driven model comes into to full fruition, to dominate the media industry, you have, in truth, a considerable diminution of diversity, but an appearance that all voices are being heard, and that you're having universal access and universal reach. So this is what Mill was bemoaning about as the loss of as the reign of mediocrity. Now let me quickly move ahead, and I'll just wind up in 5 minutes. I'll come to another very key thinker about who also has important insights to offer in this respect. Yes, that's it, Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes provides deeper insights into a manner that a discourse inspired by narrow self-interest was recast within a broader social whole as part of a shared credo. With all that had changed in France since 1789, now Barthes essentially is dealing with France as native land. Barthes considered it a remarkable phenomenon that a certain regime of ownership, a certain order, a certain ideology remains at a deeper level. In terms of naming this regime, there were other strange conventions at work. The bourgeoisie could be named with little reserve as an economic fact, but transiting to the realm of politics, the same class showed serious difficulty in acknowledging itself. In the public discourse, it wouldn't acknowledge itself as a decisive player. It would acknowledge itself in the economic sphere as the entrepreneurs and the people who held the key to progress. But in the political sphere, they were anxious to portray themselves as just anybody else. There were, Barthes observed, no bourgeois parties in any of the chambers of popular representation, nor indeed in the wider political fray. The bourgeoisie was defined as a social class which does not want to be named. The nation afforded the bourgeoisie with a means of synthesis to gather various other strata into its fold, notably the intermediate or shapeless classes. This was a project accomplished through ideological means, providing through the press, the news and literature, the varnish of the national and by extension the natural on which all that was associated with the bourgeois hegemony rested. The bourgeoisie is constantly absorbing into its ideology a whole section of humanity which does not have its basic status and cannot live up to it except in imagination. That is at the cost of an immobilization and an impoverishment of consciousness. So myth is the term of art that Barthes gives to this process of fostering a public discourse that makes what is contingent seem eternal, that strips the history out of the social reality and makes it appear as part of the natural order. Now, there cannot be an alternative. There is no alternative. That argument we hear often. Now, that is very much an ideological device used to bolster that situation of bourgeois hegemony. Now, I'm sure as media students, all of you would have known of Marshall McLuhan's work and how he's spoken about the printed word, homogenizing the sense of national identity. And this, of course, it was scattered through his writing, it was not systematically developed. But then later, Benedict Anderson brings that into his discourse, where he speaks about imagined communities and print capitalism being a kind of contributor to the growth of that sense of nationalism, the imagination of the nation as a unified whole, because the newspaper creates that sense of shared interests, shared identities, and shared priorities. And the growth of print, which happens concurrently with the growth of the industrial capitalism, creates that solidarity of the imagined community. The passage of years has altered the reality of the relationship between the media and its audience. Media now is understood not as a transmission of a message through neutral, mechanical, and electrical processes, but as the propagation of a sense of a system of meanings that audiences diversely associate themselves with. In this sense, the modern sociology of the media views it as an apparatus, or more so a process of creating shared meanings that an audience can identify with, that equips people with the vocabulary and the empirical knowledge to engage in a public conversation. The media is not just about answering a community's needs for information, it is as much about constituting that community. The media cannot be understood except as an institution organically linked to the evolution of modern social identities, whether acceptable and respectable national identities or more narrowly defined sectarian identities. The story of how the Indian nation has been established as a composite of identities with a variety of linguistic expressions English, Hindi, and a formally recognized list of over a score of other languages, is one that has been told in various ways. It remains to be told in terms of the evolution of print capitalism. There are a few recent works that have come out in the regional context, Bengali, Marathi, little bit in Malayalam, but for most part remains unstated, unstudied. Today, with the diffusion of print capitalism itself being rather patchy and sporadic, the Indian social reality is being overtaken by a burgeoning electronic media with its seeming multiplicity of news sources. Seeming multiplicity, I say. It's not a real diversity, but it's a seeming diversity. And the seeming, and that is essentially because of the nature of the competition that drives it, the competition of advertisement and the kind of overpowering influence of mediocrity as the governing principle. And the social media is the big new player in the scene. Now that is where we are going to be focusing our attention right in the next 1.5 days. Transforming the public discourse in volatile and unpredictable ways. We've seen some of the kind of frisons that the social media have caused in the recent past. You know, the election campaign that was mentioned by Professor Alankar Numani, the Anna Hazare kind of insurrection of the middle class in Delhi and other parts of the country, the protests over the December 16 gang rape in 2012 in Delhi, which kind of literally shook the establishment. I've not seen, I was resident in Delhi at that time, I've never seen a context in which an established government has felt so vulnerable and so threatened. So the public discourse is being transformed in volatile and unpredictable ways. As the social media orchestrated civil insurrections in recent times shows, research projects in this area are often overtaken by events even as they are launched. Now, because the scenario is changing so rapidly that just as you get to come to grips with events over the last 2 years, it started changing already. What is required then may be a full-fledged research agenda that networks a large number of agents with shared perceptions on how to use the new media resources for the public good. Now, there's inherent potential in this because it's accessible. There's no constraint imposed by advertising. So there is a potential for making it a reality, the right of free speech, which is like in the real sense in which the UDHR states. But that can't be taken for granted. We need to work on it. It can be used both for good and for ill. The research in this domain needs necessarily to be integrated with public action. Now, if you think that the pressure of commercialization is being diminished by social media, I will quote to you a recent study which shows that 20% of news content in the US today is accessed through Facebook. And we don't have corresponding study in terms of Google News or Twitter, but if you add up all these social media sites, you will understand that a large part of the traffic in news websites is driven through the social media. So there's this risk of ghettoization of imagination there also, because my Facebook friends are people who I agree with. So all the news items that I see, news items that I will tend to agree with, and I lose the diversity that ostensibly social media is supposed to bring to me. So this shows that commercial pressure is very much active, despite all the euphoria about the means that we all have to make ourselves heard. We have to ask, who are we being heard by, and to what purpose? And there's nothing to be taken for granted. Diversity is still very much a distant dream. The means to achieve that ideal state are within our grasp, and I think maybe we'll talk about it in the next day and a half. We'll continue the conversation. But I thank you all for this patient hearing, and look forward to the rest of the deliberations.